Good morning. I want to welcome everyone participating in today's webinar, Nonprofit Succession Planning Made Easy. My name is Trevor Williams, and I am an audit partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors, formerly Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman, and I will be one of today's presenters. I'd like to start off today with some quick housekeeping items and explain what you will need to earn CPE credit. Participants seeking CPE credit today must complete and submit a short evaluation survey that will appear automatically immediately following the webinar. You will be asked to recall these words in order to receive credit. Please write down the CPE words when they are given and keep them until you receive your certificate. They will not be provided again. If you have any technical questions or issues during the webinar, please use the questions function to speak with our webinar administrator for assistance. The slide deck and recording from today's webinar will be available for download at the link shown here. You will also receive a follow-up email with direct links. Technical support and CPE questions may be addressed to Dominic Acosta at dacosta@grfcpa.com. Today's learning objective is to provide attendees with a better understanding of the three approaches to executive succession planning and how they can create impact for the organization. And one CPE credit is available for this webinar. I would like to introduce a nonprofit leadership transition expert, Don Tebe. Don is a leadership succession consultant and the author of Chief Executive Transitions, How to Hire and Support a Nonprofit CEO, published by BoardSource, and the Nonprofit CEO Succession Roadmap, your guide for the journey to life's next chapter. As a former nonprofit executive director and 5-time interim CEO, he has experienced the challenges of leadership transitions firsthand. Since starting his consulting practice in 1993, he has helped hundreds of nonprofit leaders plan for and manage turnover in their chief executive position. I will now turn the presentation over to Don.
Thanks, Trevor, and I'd like to add my welcome to everyone, and let's jump right into it. So today we're going to cover these topics. First, we're going to talk about why plan for leadership succession, and then we're going to create the distinction between succession planning versus transition planning. We're going to talk about 3 types of succession planning: leader development planning, departure defined planning, which I like to refer to as exit planning, and backup planning, which I also refer to as succession essentials. And then we're going to step through some easy steps to get succession essentials in place. And there's also a handout that goes along with today's presentation that will walk you through that entire process. So with that, let's jump right into the first topic today, and that's why plan for leadership succession. Leadership succession helps us deal with one of those fundamental truths that we oftentimes avoid, and that's that truth that, no matter what, every job and every career ends in a transition. It's simply a matter of when, how, and how well managed when that transition finally occurs. And succession planning really is all about that how well managed piece of it. And the second point, in particular, why should we plan for CEO succession? And that's really the fundamental point there that's often overlooked, is that it's the board's most important responsibility, or among the most important responsibilities, and probably their least understood job. And succession planning really helps us get beyond those two facts.
And Don, that's a very great point that you just mentioned. I'm being a board member myself on previous boards and existing boards. Not one time that I can recall it's ever been discussed that, it's the board's responsibility. And it basically leads us into what you said, that it's the least understood job.
Yeah, I mean, you really think about it, transitions happen intermittently, thank God, in most cases.
Right, exactly.
But, the only guidance that really the board ever has about this, written guidance, is usually in the bylaws, and it's that one line that says the board has the responsibility to hire and supervise the CEO. It doesn't say how to do that. And that's really what succession planning is all about.
Great point.
So there's lots of things that succession planning can do. We wanted to highlight 4 of them here. One is to avoid the risks of unplanned absences. Make sure that your organization doesn't take a performance hit when there's a key individual absent. We're going to talk about how to do that. You can build organizational sustainability and capacity. Oftentimes we think of succession planning. Well, a lot of times what comes to mind is insurance policy. And it's a lot more than that. If you really do it right, if you really dig into it, and it can be a great way really to spotlight capacity issues in your organization and spotlight other areas where you can, strengthen your organization's sustainability. Succession planning leads to better managed transitions. As we said earlier, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when, how, and how well managed. Obviously, this is going to help deal with the how well managed question. And the fourth point that we'd like to make is that it really can fuel organizational performance, particularly leadership development planning can introduce a level of vibrancy in an organization, can spotlight leadership issues and so forth. So it really can be a great way to fuel your organization's performance, not just have that insurance policy that we usually think of. So let's talk, before we get into succession planning, let's talk about the difference between succession planning versus transition planning. This timeline here outlines sort of my conceptualization of the succession process. Really there are 3 stages to it. That there's what I call the sustaining phase, the phase leading up to the transition time. And I call it the sustaining phase because that's really I think the work of the organization or the work of the leadership, work of the board is really to make sure that the organization is sustainable, operating well, and that when time comes that it's really ready to hand off with pride to a successor. And then about 6 to 12 months, sometimes 18 months, depending on the organization, depending on the departure circumstances of the executive, you move into the transitioning phase. And the big shift there is that you're really focused on the handoff, to the successor, finding the successor, onboarding, identifying the successor, making sure that the organization is ready for the succession or the transition process. And as the organization and everybody's ready to onboard the successor, which is really about the post-hire stage. The post-hire stage is all about initially onboarding the new chief executive or the new leader, and then making sure that they're well supported, that there's clarity about their goals, roles, performance measures, and accountability systems. So that's really the kind of the conceptualization of the timeline and the difference between succession and transition. Succession is really that blue arrow, actually can embrace the entire process. But the transition work really is that yellow arrow and the green arrow, the transitioning and the post-hire work.
Don, the succession timeline that you just pointed out here is interesting to me, and a couple things jump out to me. And the first of which is in that sustaining, that blue phase, the 2 to 3 years before handoff. So obviously, as early as possible definitely increases the odds of having a successful succession plan. But I was just curious, in your professional experience, do you see organizations that really do this, look at 2 to 3 years before the actual handoff?
Yeah, quite a few. When I used to be a partner in a firm called Transition Guides, and we have this program called Next Steps. And this is really what my business partner, Tom Adams, and I were focused on, was the founders and long-term executives. There's a huge cohort, still a huge cohort of baby boomers that are, that founded nonprofits or are still leading nonprofits and are in that retirement, heading into their retirement age. And so that was the audience that we really tried to reach out to. And so we did see quite a few people, particularly went through that workshop because they got the message that this is something that they really needed to do. And In fact, that's the reason why I wrote the CEO Succession Roadmap book, was really to call attention to this, that there's a lot of times, particularly with the departing executive, there's a lot of confusion about what the departing executive's role should be. Whether they're retiring or they're moving on to another position. At one end of the spectrum, there's dumping everything into the board's lap and abdicating all responsibilities with the notion that, well, the board hires my successor, so I should be completely hands off, and that's not right.
Okay.
The other end of the spectrum is the folks that want to control, the executives that want to control everything and usurp the board's responsibility. And really, my message is, it's somewhere in the middle there, that you need to take charge of your exit, and that you should be playing an active and participating role and supporting role with the board in that succession process, but neither controlling it nor abdicating all responsibility. So I'd like to see a lot more people doing that, and that's why one of the reasons why I'm so committed to webinars like this is really to get that message out there that, yeah, you should take charge of your exit. You should have a role in it. You should be supporting the board, and you should be starting as early as possible, because starting early gives you more options.
Great point. Thanks, Don. So now we've come to our first polling question. Does your organization have a written succession policy? Option A is no. Option B, yes, it includes our chief executive position. Or option C, not yet, but we are working on it. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the first CPE word. The first CPE word is policy. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot this word down, because you will need it at the end of the survey following the webinar. Again, the first CPE word is policy, P-O-L-I-C-Y. Okay, so as we are tabulating the results of the first polling question, it looks as though the vast majority has went with option 1, no. That's quite interesting, Don.
But the good news is that there's 38% that are either working on it or have one in place.
That's a good point.
Yeah, which is a bit higher than the national average, depending on what survey you look at. If you look at Board Sources survey, they say about 27% of nonprofits have a succession plan for their CEO position. Other surveys say it's about 10%. So, this is good news. Your constituency is a lot higher than the national average.
That's a great point.
So let's talk about what succession planning is. We made a distinction between transition planning and succession planning, and I'm just going to give you a really brief description here. It's basically it's plans and procedures that, and it's a systematic process that ensures the availability, continuity, and appropriate development of an organization's leadership talent. And all of those 4 highlighted words there are really important. And I would add to that a systematic process, so that what I mean by that is the process is proactive, that there are plans in place and that those plans are kept up to date as there are changes in personnel and so forth. Availability is all about making sure that you've got people available. That can range from having backup plans for people to step into roles on an emergency basis, to the other end of the spectrum, to having really good proactive forecasting and hiring processes, what might be called talent management. Continuity has to do with ensuring that there's continuity there. That could be the backup plans and so forth, but also really good exit planning processes and handoff processes to make sure that your knowledge doesn't walk out the door in the head of that former employee. You're doing what you can to capture that, and you're doing a good job to make sure that there's a good onboarding process. And appropriate development obviously is about making a commitment to leadership development, and as we'll see in a moment, that's easier than you think. So availability, continuity, and appropriate development, but all inside of a systematic process. So when we talk about transition planning, it's really about managing the turnover the management of the entire transition process. So I've outlined 6 steps or 6 tasks that the board or anyone in a management position really should kind of embrace when they think about managing a transition. Oftentimes what we do is we leap into search mode, or we panic that somebody's going to be leaving, and we try to fill that position as quickly as possible. And my message is take a step back and walk your way through these 6 deliberate tasks. First of all, recognizing that you need to manage the entire transition process, that timeline that we talked about earlier, and recognizing that that hiring decision, we oftentimes think of it as being, we reduce the transition to a hiring decision, but recognizing that that hiring decision comes wrapped inside of a lot of organizational changes, particularly in the CEO position. There's more involved than just deciding who sits in the CEO's position. That's a change process that the board really needs to embrace and supervise, or at least make sure it's managed well. Number 2, do planning for leadership change. Doing that a good job of planning for it, unpacking the job in practice, particularly if you've got a long-term person in place. Job descriptions are rarely up to date, and when they are up to date, they usually reflect the skills and traits that got the organization into the position it is today, and doesn't necessarily create the kind of job specs that you need for the future. So making sure that you unpack, refit, and recalibrate that leadership position, that position profile. We talked about what we mean by leadership continuity here, making sure that there's going to be a good handoff plan for an onboarding process for the new executive. Appropriate communications along the way. Sometimes, particularly in boards are hiring a CEO, they do it inside of a black box. They aren't really communicating very well, and what happens is people get scared. People get afraid, and they start to vote with their feet because they worry about the future of the organization. William Bridges, the great guru on transitions, identified 3 stages that people go through when they're confronted with a transition. Paradoxically, every transition begins with an ending, a sense of loss and letting go, and so that certainly is what happens when people, particularly if there's a long-term executive that's leaving, or somebody that's been in place for a long time, one of those organizational fixtures. That starts to unnerve people a little bit, and then that's immediately followed by what he called the neutral zone, this kind of ungrounded space where people are uncertain about the future. And what you want to do is you want to drive as much of that uncertainty out as possible, and the way that you do that is with good, appropriate communications throughout the process. And then just to tie up the Bridges transition model, the final step, the 3rd phase, is the new beginning, that you've arrived on the other side of the transition. So you want to fill that void with good communications. Robust search and selection process, obviously, that's got to be a key part of it. And then finally, deliberate onboarding and support. And this is a place where oftentimes boards, when they're left to their own devices, don't do a very good job of the onboarding and support. They sort of think that again, kind of back to the idea that the kind of knee-jerk reaction is, oh, this is a hiring problem, when really it's an organizational change process, and part of that change process is making sure that the new executive is onboarded well and supported well.
Don, 2 quick things jump out at me with this particular slide, and it's great information. The first thing that jumped out to me is you talking about the appropriate communications and why this is so key here, and I would agree wholeheartedly with that. And the second thing is, the emphasis that this is not just a hiring exercise. So I think those are 2 key points out of the many points on this particular slide that jump out at me personally.
That's great. Yeah, it truly is. It's an organizational change process that just happens to have a hiring decision at its core.
Exactly. So Don, I was just curious, in your experience, have you found that boards, as they go through this exercise, will they appoint a separate committee to handle the succession and transition planning, or do you feel as though it's best if the entire board participates in this?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and let me explain that. So first of all, I think a lot of it depends on your departure circumstances of your current executive. You know, if it's a long-term executive who's leaving and they're retiring and there's lots of advance notice, then, you know, and we're starting back there at that blue arrow,
right,
then I would encourage them to appoint a executive succession committee that could then move into being the transition committee to manage the rest of the, in other words, a single committee that manages the entire process. If you're you know, if your executive is leaving a little bit with a little bit less notice, that, you know, they're moving on to another job or something like that, then I still say, you know, appoint a committee, but it's a transition committee, not a search committee. I want to drive search committee out of the language,
okay,
because I think it gives people the wrong impression. It gives us back to that notion that it's a hiring decision when it really is an organizational change process. So in terms of committee, yes, it should be a board committee. Now, I would say that the core of that committee should be board members, at least 3, probably 5 board members, past, present, and prospective future board leadership. Past, so you have people who have, you know, some historical perspective on the organization. Present, so you got people that can speak authoritatively on behalf of the board, and prospective future board leadership, because when you're hiring a CEO, you're hiring for the future, right? And it'd be great to have, you know, your future board leaders involved in that hiring decision, if at all possible.
great
So
point.
that's the nucleus of the committee. Now, when we get into that blue phase, or even in whether you're in the succession phase or the transition phase, certainly you can augment the committee with, you know, members of the senior management team to bring in that management perspective, and so that you've got folks there at the table that have the on-the-ground experience as you're doing the planning work. But when it comes to making that decision about the chief executive, that really should be a board responsibilities. So my typical recommendation is board appointed committee, 3 to 5 board members, possibly augmented with staff members for the planning work. Hiring decision, it's back to the board members on that, and that they are making a recommendation to the board of a single finalist. Now, there's other things I would recommend in terms of staff interaction. Again, I don't want this to be inside the black box, but that's we're talking about succession here. That's a whole nother transition topic on how to do transition well. So,
Okay,
does that answer for you?
absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. So if you want to do a deeper dive on those 6 transition tasks, this book is available from Board Source, Chief Executive Transitions, How to Hire, Support a Nonprofit CEO. It walks through those 6 tasks and includes all sorts of, basically every kind of template that you might possibly need for managing the transition. So let's jump into those 3 types of succession plans. So type number 1 is leader development. Number 2 is departure defined, or what I call exit planning. And 3 is backup planning, or succession essentials, which we're going to take a deeper dive into in just a moment here. So type number 1, leader development planning. It's a great tool for grooming a single leader, a single individual in say, a smaller organization, to creating a pipeline of leaders in a larger organization. Why it's valuable to you is that for a number of reasons. Familiarity and trust. Oftentimes internal successors get a head start on the process. They've been swimming in the organization's waters, so they know what where the current's going. And it also can introduce a level of dynamism and have a really strong impact on morale. And it's basically a tool that any organization, just about of any size, can put in place at any time. You know, one of the great myths out there, that couple of great myths about leader development, is that it's too costly, And the second great myth is that it's only for the big guys. Only the big organizations can do this. And over my career, I've interviewed, conducted over 1,500 interviews, and I never had an executive, once say to me, "Well, I graduated from the Darden Business School, or I graduated from Yale or Harvard or whatever university business school, and then immediately, stepped into the executive director role." That just doesn't happen. And so there is an actual process. And the Center for Creative Leadership a few years back outlined what they call the 70-20-10 model. And I see this really borne out in the executives that I've interviewed over the years, that 70%, the model is that 70% of leader development happens on the job, through on-the-job experience, through stretch assignments, through rounding out experiences, so forth. Another 20% comes from what they call developmental relationships. That might be mentors in a formal situation, but more likely it's going to be those day-to-day interactions with the leaders around you, both positive and negative role models. And the final 10% is really books, formal training, so forth. Now, that 10% can happen at very pivotal moments in a person's career, so I don't want to minimize that. But if you're really talking about the bulk of leader development resources are right at hand in just about any organization of any size. It's those stretch assignments, and it's those rounding out experiences. In fact, I've got on my website, I did a case study, a video case study, an interview with the executive director of Virginia Supportive Housing. This is a smaller organization and really kind of chronicles, I think, perfectly this 70-20-10 model, because she really took her career, took ownership of her career, certainly did that, but she also had a supportive executive director. And I think at the time, they had something like 12 staff members, so it was not a huge organization. So there's proof positive that this kind of model works. So so it really involves those stretch assignments, assignments that really stretch people's thinking about themselves as a leader. There's a developmental psychologist at Stanford that really chronicled this, that really what happens when an individual starts to think of themselves as a leader is that they are gaining experience, certainly that. So they've got that experience in their hip pocket, but they're also gaining what he called self-efficacy beliefs. And that's an important part of it, and that those two need to be correlated. And that's what stretch assignments can do. The other piece of that is the rounding out experiences. And this is, I think, a place where nonprofits really could do a much better job of it, particularly if you take on the idea that we really are going to be focused on developing leaders. And that's giving people broader experience. I can't tell you how many executives I interviewed over the years for CEO positions who just couldn't connect the dots with the board, because they may have been super strong on programs, but hadn't really had enough exposure to finances. Or they might be really strong, super strong on fundraising, but really had no exposure to operations. And so the idea is to give early in my career, I was in the retail field, and their training process was pretty simple. You as a management trainee, you worked 2 weeks in the cash office, 2 weeks on the loading dock, 2 weeks in managing the front line, which is where the cash registers are, and so on and so forth. So you made the circuit of all of the departments of the store. At the end of that, you had a pretty good idea of how that store worked as an enterprise. And I think that's the point here, is that giving your people that rounding out experience. If maybe it's your fundraiser who has this really strong developmental prospect, and giving them the opportunity to work with a CFO on the annual budget, so they're getting that rounding out experience.
Great content, Don. I think the thing that jumps out at me talking about this leader development planning is the fact that it doesn't cost much, if any, money. It just involves some time and commitment, and it definitely can increase the organization's morale internally.
Absolutely. If you're appointing people internally, leaders come from somewhere.
Exactly.
And nonprofit HR did a report several years ago, and they found that 64% of nonprofits, new leaders are hired from outside of the nonprofit. Where do they come from? They come from another nonprofit.
Exactly.
You know, so why not develop your own leaders who are going to have that? They're going to be steeped in the organization's culture. They're going to know the organization inside and out. There are pluses and minuses, of course, to hiring internal candidates, but I think the pluses outweigh the minuses. And we've got a super tight talent market right now. You know, basically we have full employment. I don't think it's attainable for organizations to continue to ignore this. So let's talk quickly about departure define, or what I call exit planning. This is a great tool for, particularly for retiring leaders or other situations where the executive is going to know in advance that they're planning to leave. It's a great way to prepare the organization, the transition team, the job, and the departing leader, him or herself, for that transition process. As we talked about in the timeline earlier, the ideal time to start this is 2 to 3 years ahead of the departure. And I think we already covered this, that really the how of this is to, first of all, for the executive to take charge of their exit and to attend to their 3 jobs as a departing leader, to lead the organization through the transition, to prepare the organization for the transition process, that's supporting work with the board, and then prepare themselves for life's next chapter. And for more on that, I just published this book, The Nonprofit CEO Succession Roadmap, Your Guide for the Journey to Life's Next Chapter, which really is a comprehensive look at that. And you can read it for free on Amazon right now if you're an Amazon Kindle subscriber.
Okay, we have now come to our second polling question. Does your organization have a written backup plan that designates a cross-trained individual who can serve as backup? Option A, no. Option B, yes, for our chief executive. Option 3, yes, for our chief executive and other members of our management team. Or 4, not yet, but we are working on it. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the second CPE word. The second CPE word is retire. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot this word down because you will need it again for the survey following the webinar. Again, the second CPE word is retire, R-E-T-I-R-E. Okay, as we're looking at the results, the majority has gone with option 1, no. They do not have a written backup plan.
But the good news is half do. Looks like 15% for the CEO, 15% for the management team, CEO and the management team, and the good news is another 20% are working on it. That's great. That's great. So this brings us to our third topic, which is backup planning, or what I like to call succession essentials. And this is a tool I'm absolutely committed that every nonprofit should have in place. That's why I call it succession essentials. And basically it consists of a succession policy and a backup plan. A succession policy typically is a board adopted policy that outlines how the board will manage a transition, particularly in the CEO position. Why? Because the CEO really is the board's only employee. And then a backup plan, at least for the CEO position, and great news is that looks like about 15% of folks have them in place for their management team. That's basically making sure that there's somebody's cross-trained and ready to step in on an emergency basis. You know, the why of this is it's really an essential part of business continuity. You know, you can't have a good business continuity plan and not have a leadership continuity plan as an important piece of that. The second point I would make is that it breaks the ice about succession planning. You know, succession planning is a touchy topic still in far too many organizations. Boards don't want to bring it up for fear of the signals it sends to the executive. The executive doesn't want to bring it up for a whole variety of reasons, and so they avoid the topic altogether. And this is a great way of breaking the ice because it has nothing to do with your departure, has everything to do with good management and good continuity planning for your organization. And it can open up, depending on how you do it, you can open up a dialogue about organizational capacity. So when to do this, my encouragement is start today. And we're going to give you the tools to do that, which brings us to our next topic, and that's the 9 steps. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these 9 steps. I'm going to step through them fairly quickly because we did provide you with a handout that walks you through these 9 steps. It also provides you with templates, fill-in-the-blank templates. You can even, there's even a place where you can go on and download for free the templates in Microsoft Word format, so they're easy to edit. And also, there's a video that will step you through the process. So there's a guide, a video, and the templates all included in your handout package. So step 1 is obviously to organize the project. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on the ease of doing this rather than, walking through, each of these steps, individually. One of the points that I would make is that you want to think about how you want to do this. I've seen clients approach this project or approach this task in 2 different ways. Sometimes the CEO says, you know what, I need to get a succession policy and a backup plan in place. I'm just going to sit down and do it. So I'm going to work through these templates myself and get this thing in place. I'll hand it over to my board chair for them to review, and then we get it on the board agenda. Boom, you're done. You can have this done in under an hour if your job description is up to date. Then there's the second approach to it, and this is what I call a board education approach. And this is where you really want to be a little bit more deliberate with the board, getting them to sanction it, having them appoint a small task force, maybe with a couple board members and maybe a staff member, particularly the person that's going to be the CEO's designated backup. Why would you want to use that approach? Well, that's a great approach if you really want to educate your board about the succession process, and particularly if you've got board members that maybe don't have a business background or maybe have not been in a hiring, have had a hiring experience. They're kind of green in that area and want to kind of bring them along step by step in this process. This is a great way to do it. So 2 different approaches that you can take. There's only one right one, and that's the right one for your particular organization situation. Second step is to update the job description, as we said earlier, unpack, refit, and recalibrate the job, and particularly that recalibrate piece to make sure that the job reflects the future of the organization. Then the next 2 steps really are the heart of it, is filling in the succession policy template. As we'll see in this slide, there are placeholder terms for you to fill in with your organization's terminology, and there's annotations down the side that give you a little bit more texture about what to include in. The succession policy is basically cut and paste, and you can have that done in under 2 minutes. The backup plan is going to take a little bit longer, and that's the next step in the process, is to complete the backup plan template. This is a place where you again want to replace it with your terminology. Replace the placeholders with your terminology, and note that there are 3 attachments to this. First one is obviously just to attach to your freshly revised job description. The second attachment has some backup plan detail. When you get into the templates, you'll see that it explains a little bit more in detail, particularly what who is going to be the designated backup and what are the key functions of the chief executive. And then the third backup is really, our third attachment is really designed for small organizations where the executive director is really the sole administrator, or you have a very small management team. Basically, any situation where every night the key organizational information walks out the door inside the head of your executive director, you want to capture that. And a great place to capture that is with this key information contact inventory, and a great place to capture that is obviously when you're doing your backup plan. So the heart of it is really filling in those 2 templates. Obviously, you want to make sure that you discuss the backup plan with your designated backup. Make sure that they agree to it. Make sure that they understand the critical functions and that are required to maintain business as usual, and that you really agree about what cross-training is needed, and really have an honest and open conversation about that. If you appointed a task force, you obviously want to review this with your task force. Again, this is another educational opportunity for your board members. Yes, it's a pre-review of the documents before they're sent to the board, but it's also an opportunity to level up those board members' understanding of the leadership challenges of the organization and the leadership needs, the current future leadership needs of the organization. To have those, you can have those conversations about organizational sustainability and bench depth and other capacity building issues. So it's not just an insurance policy. This is an opportunity to open up a dialogue about the organization's future leadership needs. And then review and approve by the board, send documents to the board in advance, make sure that your board chair is really briefed and up to speed on this and is supportive and going to talk this up with the board. And then step 8 is to finalize, put it on the calendar for annual review. Why would you want to do that? Well, first of all, it helps keep the plans up to date if there's an annual review process. But probably more important, it reminds the board members, at least annually, we've got these plans in place. Your board members are going to turn over. This is an opportunity to kind of, on an ongoing basis, educate those new board members. Yes, we've got these good planning tools in place, and here's what they contain. And then finally, I also want to point out that if your backup person leaves or there are personnel changes, you want to update the backup plan. So it's not just something you would do annually. You do it if you have a change of personnel. And the next to the final step, the 9th step, is to make sure that the backup person gets cross-trained. This is absolutely vital. And a bonus step, again, back to you, congratulations to that 15% that has a backup plan in place for their management team, is to use the templates for your other leadership positions. Kind of take that business continuity and leadership continuity to the next level. Make sure that your backup, that your executive team or management team members complete their own backup plans. It's going to yield, again, back to the idea, it's not just an insurance policy. This can help you gain some insights about bench depth in your organization and coverage of key functions. Again, opening up that dialogue about current and future leadership needs. Again, all this is in the handout, the step-by-step guide, the fill in the blank templates. You can download the Microsoft Word versions, and there's a free video that will walk you through this process in detail.
Okay. Before we come to this third polling question, I just had a quick question, and Don, I really enjoyed listening to you talk about the 9 steps plus that bonus step. But I was just curious about step number 5, where you talk about discuss the plan with the designated backup. Now, I would assume in this particular step, it would be acceptable to have the designated backup provide some input with regards to the plan and the various roles and responsibilities.
Oh, absolutely. Because they're going to have to step into that. I can one quick story that comes to mind is working with a client. The COO had been with the organization for 19 years, was in charge of all the programs and so forth. A very strong manager and a really strong individual. The CEO had been with the organization for 28 years. We're walking through we're helping this organization put these plans in place, and we're stepping through the critical functions piece of that that attachment, and budget check, personnel management check, checking all the boxes, and we got down to the box about governance, the question of responsive key function around governance, and she just blanched. Because the executive had kept the board kind of inside this box, and really, even though she had been there that long, she really didn't have that much interaction with the board or how a board functions. So one of the pieces that we put in place as part of that, it was a coach for her if she needed to step into that, so a governance coach that would, coach on that process, and also getting the executive to, give her more responsibility and more, more face time, with the board. So it's those kinds of insights that you can, it's not just, this insurance policy, or we're checking off the boxes, or filling in the templates, but it's really kind of looking at your organization through that lens, and really kind of making sure that you've got, that you're really, using this to its fullest to build your organization's capacity. To just wrap up that story, the executive left short time later for a variety of reasons, and she needed to step into that role. She stepped into it very seamlessly because she had been, well prepared.
Excellent, excellent. And again, just wanted to note to everyone on the webinar that the various guides that Don spoke about will be available in follow-up emails sent later today. So now we've come to the third and final polling question. I'm interested in learning more about A, how soon to retire executives plan their exit from their role, B, strategies for developing leaders within my organization, or C, how to strategically use HR to strengthen my organization's impact. We're getting a lot of activity on this last question, Don.
That's very cool.
So it appears as though the majority of the respondents have picked item number 2, strategies for developing leaders within my organization.
But there's also a strong showing there about how soon to retire executives plan their exit. So that's gratifying. That 25% number gratifies me because it's probably pretty close to the need out there. When you think about how many positions are going to turn over.
And before we continue with the wrap-up questions, I just wanted to point out the final CPE word. The final CPE word is exit. Again, if you want to receive CPE credit, please jot this word down because you will need it following the webinar. Again, the final CPE word is exit, E-X-I-T. So again, before we wrap up today, we want to answer just a few questions submitted by our online participants and any others. Okay, Don, it looks as though we have one question that's come up, and it reads as such. Earlier, you briefly mentioned talent management. Can you give us a 1 or 2 sentence description of what it is, what it does, and how these succession plans we just discussed might be involved?
Absolutely. So talent management is oftentimes referred to as strategic HR. It's a process of really strategically planning your human resources functions in your organization to link, your goals on one hand with your impact on the other hand. It's really all about forecasting and assessing and developing your leadership talent, and making sure that you've got a good robust onboarding process. So really it's really using your HR very strategically. I think for a smaller organization, back to the question about leadership development, I think there are 2 things the two P's that I would encourage people to have in mind as they think about, who might be a good prospect to develop as a potential internal successor for the CEO position, and that's performance and prospects. In HR, the past performance, unlike stocks, past performance is a pretty good predictor of future performance, and the prospects for that individual to move up to ladder. Getting back to that video case study that I have on my website, I think this young woman embodied both of those things perfectly. That she had really good performance, and she had great prospects to move up, and fortunately she had an executive director that recognized that and supported her in a small organization.
Great. Okay, looks like we have a couple more minutes to answer some additional questions. We have another one here, and it reads as such. How can this sort of planning be integrated into an organization's strategic planning process, or can it?
Absolutely can. It can both be done, separately as well as part of the strategic planning process. for example, for a lot of strategic plans, they focus on just developing of the strategies and really don't get into a lot of the capacity issues of the organization. And this is a place where you can bring in strategic HR to kind of take that strategic plan to the next level and really get into, okay, here's how we're going to carry this out, how we're actually going to implement this. So that's just one, quick example. I know we're pressed for time here.
Okay, all right. I think we have time for one more. I have one here and it reads as such. What's a reasonable timeline or range of timelines from start to finish for putting together a robust initial succession and backup plan?
Well, if you're really talking about succession essentials, again, that depends on how you approach it. If you're taking kind of I guess what you might call the quick and dirty approach, where the executive's sitting down and filling in those templates, him or herself, that can be done typically in a couple hours or less. If you're really talking about doing this with a more deliberate fashion, really with an eye towards educating the board, then it's usually a process of 4 to 6 weeks in my experience. Mainly because you want to have a couple different touch points with your committee, and depending on how many of those touch points, a lot of it is really driven around people scheduling more than anything else. Again, back to the point, the templates, it doesn't really take any time at all to fill those in. What really takes time is, that deliberation process and that process of educating, particularly those board members.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more, and this is a great question, and it seems as though people are really enjoying the subject matter here, Don. Again, everyone wants to know where can they find these templates. And again, the guides that Don spoke will be available in the follow-up email sent later today. So that's great news. That's great to see. People are definitely interested in this subject matter. So in conclusion, if you have any additional questions after today's program, please reach out to us. Our contact information appears here. With that, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We encourage you to follow us on social media at GRF CPAs and visit our website shown here for additional information on our upcoming webinars. Please remember to complete the emailed survey that follows if you would like to earn CPE credit for attending today's webinar. Thank you all again for attending and have a great day.